What would you do if your own parents looked at your child across the dinner table and calmly told her she wasn't really family? Not whispered, not said in anger, just stated like a simple fact. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Because that's exactly what happened to me. It was a quiet Sunday evening in late October. The kind of evening that usually feels safe, familiar, predictable. My name is Lena Carter. I'm 34 years old, a pediatric nurse, and the mother of the most thoughtful 9-year-old girl I've ever known, my daughter Sophie. That night, Sophie and I were sitting at my parents' dining table in their house outside Columbus, Ohio. The same house I grew up in. The same dining room where we'd celebrated birthdays, holidays, graduations. The table looked exactly the same as it always had. My mother Margaret had roasted chicken. My father Thomas poured wine like he always did. The big wooden clock on the wall ticked steadily behind us. Everything felt normal. Until it didn't. Sophie sat beside me, swinging her feet slightly under the chair the way kids do when they're trying to behave like adults. She was carefully cutting her chicken into perfect little squares. She'd always been like that. Thoughtful. Careful. And she adored visiting her grandparents. Which is why what happened next hit so hard. My mom suddenly put down her fork. Not dramatically. Just slowly. Then she looked directly at Sophie. Not at me. At my daughter. And she said something that froze the entire room. You're not real family. Just like that. No anger. No hesitation. For words. The clock on the wall kept ticking. Sophie stopped moving. Her fork stayed frozen halfway to her plate. She looked at my mother, confused at first, the way kids do when they're trying to figure out if an adult is joking. But Margaret wasn't smiling. She was watching Sophie very carefully. Then Sophie turned her head and looked at me. Not crying. Not panicking. Just searching my face for an explanation. Mom, what does she mean? That moment stretched longer than I can explain. Have you ever had a moment where you know exactly what you should say, but something inside you tells you to wait? That was me. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I just sat there. Watching. Because something about my mother's tone felt planned. Across the table, my father suddenly became very interested in his wine glass. He avoided eye contact entirely, which was strange. My father was never good at hiding his reactions. So why was he so quiet tonight? Sophie looked back at my mom again. Grandma? But Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she folded her hands together like she'd been waiting years for this exact moment. You deserve to know the truth, she said calmly. The truth. That word landed heavy in the room. And suddenly I understood something that made my stomach tighten. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. This was intentional. You see, my husband Michael Reeves died 10 years ago. A car accident. 2 months before Sophie was born. For years, my parents had danced around the same quiet suspicion. They never said it outright. But it lived in the small comments, the sideways glances. Things like, that pregnancy happened awfully quickly after Michael died. Or, she doesn't really look like him. At first I ignored it. Then I learned to brush it off. Because grief does strange things to people. But tonight my mother wasn't hinting. She was accusing. And she chose to say it in front of a 9-year-old girl. Sophie's voice got quieter. Grandma, are you saying my dad isn't my dad? No one answered. That silence said more than any argument could. I felt Sophie's hand slowly slide into mine under the table. Small. Cold. Waiting for me to fix something I couldn't even explain yet. I opened my mouth to speak. But before a single word came out, the doorbell rang. Loud. Sharp. Unexpected. Every head in the room turned toward the hallway. No one had been invited. No one was expected. The sound echoed through the house again. My dad stood up first. Slowly. His chair scraped across the floor. Who on earth? He muttered. He walked toward the front door. The hallway light flicked on. From where I sat at the dining table, I could only see his back as he reached for the handle. And I remember thinking something strange in that moment. My mother suddenly looked nervous. Really nervous. Her hands tightened around the edge of the table. Why? Then the front door opened. A man stood outside. Mid-30s. Suit jacket. Professional. Calm. He looked past my father and into the house. His eyes landed directly on my mother. Not me. Her. Then he raised a single envelope. Plain white. Official looking. And he said something that made the air in the room feel instantly heavier. "I believe this belongs to your daughter." My father frowned. "My daughter?" The man nodded once. "Yes, Lena Carter." My mother's face drained of color. Completely. I had never seen her look afraid before. Not once in my life. But in that moment, Margaret Carter looked like she'd just seen a ghost. And the man at the door hadn't even stepped inside yet. Because what he was holding in that envelope was something my mother had tried to get her hands on for 10 years. And the second he said the next sentence, everything about that dinner changed. But what none of us realized yet was that the truth inside that envelope would prove something my mother never expected. And it would turn the meaning of real family completely upside down. Have you ever looked back at a moment and suddenly realized none of it was random? That every small detail you ignored at the time was actually part of something bigger? Because the more I replayed that dinner in my mind later, the clearer it became. My mother hadn't just blurted something cruel. She had set the stage for it. And it started 4 days earlier. It was Wednesday afternoon when my phone rang while I was finishing a shift at the pediatric ward. The caller ID said Mom. Now, my mother Margaret Carter wasn't the type to call just to chat. She preferred short texts. Efficient. Practical. So when I answered and heard her unusually warm voice, I noticed immediately. "Lena, we should have dinner this Sunday," she said. "You and Sophie. Just family. Just family." At the time, the words didn't mean anything. But now they echo in my head differently. I asked if it was a special occasion. "No," she said lightly. "We just haven't spent time together in a while." That part was true. Between my hospital shifts and Sophie's school schedule, visits had become less frequent. But Sophie loved going there. My parents' house had a huge backyard, a swing set my dad built years ago, and a golden retriever named Charlie, who followed Sophie everywhere. So of course I said yes. And Sophie was thrilled. All week she talked about it. "Do you think Grandpa will help me build the birdhouse we started?" she asked one night. "Probably," I told her. "And Grandma might make apple pie," she added hopefully. The innocence in her voice makes what happened next even harder to think about. Sunday arrived quietly. When we pulled into my parents' driveway just before 6, the house looked exactly the same as always. Warm lights glowing through the windows. The smell of roasted chicken drifting through the air. My dad opened the door with his usual half-smile. "Sophie," he said, bending down as she ran inside. For a moment, everything felt completely normal. My mother hugged me quickly and went back to the kitchen. The table was already set. White plates. Polished silverware. Wine glasses placed perfectly. But there were a few details I didn't notice until later. Small things. My mother kept checking the time. Not casually. Repeatedly. Every few minutes her eyes flicked toward the clock on the wall. And there was something else. A thin manila folder sitting on the sideboard behind her chair. At the time I assumed it was just paperwork. Bills maybe. But now I realized something chilling. That folder had been placed there deliberately. Dinner started normally enough. We talked about Sophie's school project. My dad asked about my hospital shift. My mother asked polite questions, but seemed distracted. Then halfway through dinner, she stopped eating. That was the moment everything shifted. She placed her fork down, looked directly at Sophie, and said the sentence that still echoes in my mind. "You're not real family." Now here's something important to understand about my mother. Margaret Carter doesn't say things without preparation. She believes in certainty, in evidence, in proof, which meant something terrifying. She believed she already had it. Back at the dining table, Sophie was still staring at her. "Grandma, are you saying my dad isn't my dad?" Margaret didn't answer immediately. But she also didn't deny it. Instead, she said something that made my stomach drop. "We all deserve honesty, Sophie. Especially when lies have gone on this long." Lies. She looked straight at me when she said that. And suddenly I realized what tonight actually was. This wasn't a dinner. It was an intervention. My father still hadn't said a word. He kept staring at his plate, which was strange because normally he would try to calm situations like this. But tonight he stayed quiet, as if he already knew what was coming. I leaned forward. "Mom," I said carefully, "you need to stop." But Margaret didn't stop. In fact, she looked more confident by the second. "You were pregnant 2 months after Michael died," she said calmly. Sophie looked confused. My heart started pounding. "You expect us to believe that child is his?" There it was. 10 years of suspicion finally spoken out loud. The thing she'd hinted at for a decade. My daughter's hand tightened around mine. "Mom, what's she saying?" I could feel the anger rising in my chest. But before I could respond, the doorbell rang. Sharp. Sudden. Completely unexpected. Everyone froze. My dad stood up slowly. "I'll get it," he muttered. As he walked down the hallway toward the front door, my mother's confident expression suddenly flickered. Just for a moment. Something like worry crossed her face, which confused me. Why would she look nervous? This was her moment. Her accusation. Her proof. Right? The door opened. A man stood outside in a dark jacket. Professional. Calm. He introduced himself clearly. Daniel Reeves. My dad frowned. "Can I help you?" Daniel held up the envelope. "I'm looking for Lena Carter." My father glanced back toward the dining room. "That's my daughter." Daniel nodded. "Yes, I know." He stepped slightly forward. "And this concerns Michael Reeves' estate." The second my mother heard Michael's name, her chair scraped loudly across the floor. She stood up. Pale. Completely pale. And that's when Daniel said the sentence that made the room fall into absolute silence. "This envelope contains the DNA results your mother requested 10 years ago." The air in the room felt like it had been sucked out completely. Sophie looked confused. My dad looked stunned. And my mother. My mother looked like she had just realized something had gone very, very wrong. But what Daniel said next would prove that the truth she had waited 10 years to see was not the truth she thought she was getting. Because that's exactly where the night was heading. The man standing at my parents' front door stepped inside slowly, holding that plain white envelope like it weighed 100 pounds. His name, he had said, was Daniel Reeves. And the second he mentioned Michael's estate, the entire energy in the house changed. My father stood awkwardly near the doorway, unsure whether to invite him further in or ask him to leave. But Daniel didn't look like someone who had come to argue. He looked like someone who had come to finish something. Something official. Something long overdue. Back in the dining room, Sophie was still sitting beside me, quietly holding my hand. Her eyes moved between the hallway and my mother, trying to understand why the adults in the room suddenly looked like statues. Margaret was the first one to move. She walked toward the hallway with stiff, controlled steps. "How did you get this address?" she asked Daniel. Her voice had lost all the confidence it carried 5 minutes earlier. Daniel answered calmly. "You provided it." That sentence landed like a stone in water. Margaret blinked. "I did no such thing." "Yes, you did," Daniel replied. 10 years ago. Now everyone was staring. Because suddenly something from the past was stepping back into the room. Something none of us knew about. Daniel stepped into the dining room. He looked around once before placing the envelope gently on the table. "I believe this conversation involves the entire family," he said. My father finally spoke. "What exactly is this about?" Daniel rested a hand lightly on the envelope. "Mrs. Carter requested a DNA verification regarding the paternity of Sophie Carter approximately 10 years ago." Silence. Complete silence. My father slowly turned toward my mother. "You did what?" Margaret straightened slightly, trying to regain control of the situation. "I had reasonable concerns," she said. That phrase alone told me everything. For 10 years, my mother hadn't just been suspicious. She had been investigating. Behind my back. Behind Sophie's back. Daniel continued speaking calmly. "The original request was submitted through our firm. Mrs. Carter hired a private investigator who collected a DNA sample." My stomach dropped. "What sample?" I asked. Daniel looked at me carefully. A toothbrush belonging to Sophie. The room felt suddenly colder. Sophie looked up at me. "What's DNA?" she asked quietly. I squeezed her hand gently. "Just something doctors use to understand families," I said softly. But inside, my mind was racing. My mother had tested my daughter. Without permission. Without telling me. 10 years ago. Margaret spoke again, defensive now. "The timeline didn't make sense," she said. "You were pregnant almost immediately after Michael died." Her voice sharpened slightly. "And I had a right to know the truth." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes. And the test was conducted." My father leaned forward. "Then why are we hearing about it now?" "Good question." 10 years was a long time for a test result. Daniel took a breath before answering. "Because the initial analysis triggered additional legal complications." That phrase hung in the air. Legal complications. Margaret frowned. "What does that mean?" Daniel looked down at the envelope. The first DNA comparison showed a strong probability that Sophie Carter was biologically related to Michael Reeves. Margaret's eyes widened. "But..." Daniel raised a hand slightly. That alone was not the issue. He slid the envelope closer to the center of the table. The issue was what the test revealed beyond simple paternity. Now everyone leaned forward slightly. My father looked confused. My mother looked alarmed. And Sophie. Sophie just looked nervous. Daniel carefully opened the envelope. Inside were several documents. Official forms. Lab reports. Legal letters. He lifted the first sheet and read from it calmly. Genetic comparison confirms with 99.98% probability that Sophie Carter is the biological daughter of Michael Reeves. For a moment, no one spoke. My mother's entire theory had just collapsed. 10 years of suspicion. Gone in one sentence. My father slowly leaned back in his chair. "Well," he said quietly. But Daniel didn't stop there. He set the first document aside. Then he lifted the second. And his tone changed slightly. "However," he continued, "the genetic verification also revealed something else." Margaret's voice trembled now. "What else?" Daniel placed the second paper on the table. The DNA confirmation identified Sophie Carter as the only verified biological heir to the Reeves family estate. My brain struggled to process that. "The what?" I asked. Daniel looked directly at me. Michael Reeves' extended family maintained a trust fund and property holdings that remained legally unresolved after several family members passed away over the past decade. My father blinked slowly. "You're saying?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Then he said the sentence that turned the entire evening upside down. "Your daughter has just been legally recognized as the sole heir to an estate currently valued at approximately $4 million. The sound that followed was sharp. A glass hitting the floor. Margaret's wine glass had slipped from her hand and shattered across the tile. But that wasn't the most shocking part. The most shocking part was the look on her face. Because 10 minutes earlier she had tried to erase Sophie from the family. And now the law had just confirmed something she never expected. Sophie wasn't just part of the family. She carried the entire legacy. But as the room tried to absorb that news, Daniel slowly closed the folder and said something else. Something that made my mother's hands begin to shake. "Unfortunately," he said carefully, "there is one more detail regarding how this discovery happened." And when he revealed that part, the irony of the entire situation became impossible to ignore. Because the person responsible for uncovering Sophie's inheritance was the very person who tried to prove she didn't belong. What if the moment someone tried to erase a child from the family ended up proving that child was the most important member of it? Because that's exactly what was unfolding at that dinner table. The broken wine glass still lay scattered across the floor when Daniel finished speaking. No one moved. Not my father. Not my mother. Not even Sophie. The only sound in the room was the steady ticking of that old wall clock. For $1 million. The number felt unreal. But the money wasn't the part that stunned me the most. It was the look on my mother's face. 10 minutes earlier, Margaret Carter had looked confident. Certain. Now she looked like the ground under her feet had disappeared. Daniel calmly gathered the loose papers back into a neat stack. Then he looked directly at Margaret. There's something else you should understand, he said. My mother swallowed. What? Daniel folded his hands lightly. The DNA verification you requested triggered a legal audit of the Reeves family estate. My father frowned. Audit? Daniel nodded. Yes. At the time the test was conducted, several members of the Reeves extended family had recently passed away. He paused. And none of them had direct descendants. Now the picture was starting to form. Daniel continued. The trust holding their combined assets required confirmation of a biological heir before the estate could be transferred. My father leaned forward slightly. And that heir is Sophie? Daniel nodded again. Yes. He glanced toward my daughter, who was now staring at the table in quiet confusion. Multiple labs confirmed the results over the past several years. Several years. I blinked. Wait, I said. Several years. Daniel turned toward me. Yes. Then why are we only hearing about this now? Good question. A very good question. Daniel rested his hands on the table before answering. Because the firm needed time to verify Sophie's identity and confirm the estate records. He explained that the Reeves family had several properties, investments, and trust accounts spread across different states. Some of the documentation dated back decades. Before the money could legally pass to anyone, the firm had to prove one thing beyond doubt. That Sophie Carter was truly Michael Reeves' biological child. So they ran the tests again. And again. Every time the results came back the same. 99.98% match. Which meant something extraordinary. Not only was Sophie Michael's daughter, she was the last direct Reeves descendant alive. My father leaned back slowly. That's unbelievable. But Daniel wasn't finished explaining. Without Mrs. Carter's original DNA request, he said calmly, this verification process would never have started. My mother blinked. What are you saying? Daniel looked at her carefully. I'm saying that your investigation is the reason Sophie's inheritance was discovered. The room went completely still. Think about the irony for a moment. Margaret Carter had spent 10 years doubting Sophie's place in the family. And her attempt to prove Sophie didn't belong had just secured Sophie's place in a completely different family legacy. My father let out a slow breath. Well, he said quietly. That backfired. Margaret shot him a look, but she didn't argue. Because she couldn't. The truth was sitting in front of her in black ink and legal signatures. Sophie finally spoke again. Her voice small but steady. Mom? I looked down at her. Yes, sweetheart. She hesitated. Does this mean Grandpa Michael really was my dad? The question hit me harder than anything else that night. For years Sophie had grown up with stories about Michael. Photos on the wall. Old home videos. Memories she had borrowed from me. And now the world had just tried to tell her those memories might not be real. I squeezed her hand gently. Yes, I said softly. He really was. Sophie nodded slowly, as if she needed a moment to let that settle. Then she asked another question. One no adult in the room was prepared for. So, why did Grandma say I wasn't family? My mother's shoulders stiffened. The question hung in the air like a spotlight. Daniel quietly closed the folder of documents. My father looked down at the floor. And my mother. For the first time in my entire life. Margaret Carter had no answer. But just when it seemed like the biggest revelations of the night were over, Daniel cleared his throat. There is actually one final matter, he said. Every head turned toward him again. My mother looked exhausted now. What else could there possibly be? Daniel slid one last document across the table. But he didn't open it. Instead, he looked directly at me. This final instruction was written by Michael Reeves himself. My heart skipped. What? Daniel nodded once. Yes. He tapped the sealed page lightly. And it explains exactly why these results had to be delivered, in person, to this entire family. The room felt suddenly smaller. Sophie squeezed my hand again. My father leaned forward. My mother looked terrified. Because whatever Michael had written, he had written it knowing one day someone might question his daughter. And whatever message he left behind, it was meant to answer that doubt forever. But when Daniel finally opened the last page, the words Michael wrote would change the entire meaning of that night. And they would leave my mother facing a truth she never expected. Because that's what happened next. The room had already absorbed more shock than any family dinner should hold in a lifetime. The broken glass on the floor. The envelope. The DNA results. The inheritance no one knew existed. But the document Daniel held now felt different. It wasn't a lab report. It wasn't legal paperwork. It was a letter. And it was written by Michael, my husband, a man who had been gone for 10 years. Daniel carefully unfolded the final page. You could hear the paper move. That's how quiet the room was. My father leaned forward with his elbows on the table. My mother sat stiff in her chair, her hands folded tightly like she was bracing for impact. And Sophie looked up at me, curious. Is that from my dad? She whispered. I swallowed. I think so. Daniel looked around the room before he started reading. Michael Reeves left this written instruction attached to his estate documentation, he explained. It was to be delivered if Sophie's paternity was ever formally questioned or legally verified. My mother's eyes widened slightly, which meant something important. Michael had expected this. He had predicted it. Daniel began reading. My daughter may never remember meeting me, the letter started. The words hit me immediately. I felt my throat tighten. Sophie sat very still beside me. But if this letter is being read, Daniel continued, then someone has asked a question about whether she belongs. Margaret looked down at the table. Daniel kept reading. So let me answer that question myself. The room felt heavy, almost sacred. Michael's words were simple, direct, exactly the way he used to speak when he was alive. If Sophie is my child, and I believe with my whole heart that she is, then she belongs to this family more than anyone. I felt tears sting the corners of my eyes. Daniel continued. And if anyone ever doubts her place, then they've forgotten what family actually means. My father slowly exhaled. But the letter wasn't finished. Daniel, read the next line. That's why I arranged for DNA confirmation to be attached to the estate records. My mother's head snapped up. Daniel nodded slightly as he continued reading. Yes, you read that correctly, he said before continuing. Because if Sophie ever has to prove she belongs, Michael had written, then the proof will already exist. That line landed like thunder. My husband had predicted everything. The suspicion, the questions, the doubt, even the DNA test. He had already prepared for it. Daniel finished the letter. My daughter will grow up hearing many things about family, bloodlines, and legacy. But the truth is simple. Family is not the people who question whether you belong. Family is the people who never make you prove it. Daniel folded the letter slowly. No one spoke. Not for a long time. The ticking clock on the wall sounded louder than ever. Then Sophie broke the silence. Her small voice cut through the tension in the most unexpected way. So, Grandpa Michael knew about me. I nodded softly. Yes, he did. She thought about that for a moment. Then she asked something that hit everyone in the room like lightning. Does that mean he loved me? My voice shook when I answered. More than anything. Sophie smiled slightly. And in that moment, something incredible happened. The entire tension of the night, the accusations, the suspicion, the anger. None of it mattered to her. Because the only question she cared about had just been answered. Across the table, my mother finally spoke. Her voice was quiet. Much quieter than it had been earlier that evening. I didn't know he wrote that. No one responded immediately. Because the truth was obvious. Michael hadn't written that letter for my father. Or for Daniel. Or even for me. He wrote it for the exact moment that had just happened. The moment someone questioned his daughter. Margaret looked at Sophie again. But this time there was no suspicion in her eyes. Only regret. 10 years of it. Finally, Sophie turned toward her. Grandma? Margaret swallowed. Yes. Sophie tilted her head slightly. Am I real family now? That question hung in the air longer than anything else that night. My mother opened her mouth. But no words came out. Instead, her eyes filled with tears. She nodded. Slowly. And for the first time that evening, the truth wasn't coming from a DNA test. Or a lawyer. Or a letter from the past. It came from a 9-year-old girl who had just asked the most honest question in the room. I looked around the table. The same table where this night had started with rejection. And now it ended with something completely different. Not because of the inheritance. Not because of the DNA test. But because the truth had finally arrived. And sometimes truth arrives in the most unexpected way. Sometimes it comes through a doorbell ringing at exactly the right moment. Which makes you wonder something. What would have happened if that doorbell never rang? Would Sophie have grown up believing she didn't belong? Would my mother have kept believing her doubts? Would the truth have stayed buried forever? Maybe. Or maybe the truth always finds a way to show up eventually. Sometimes in an envelope. Sometimes in a letter written years earlier. And sometimes in the quiet courage of a child asking the simplest question of all. So let me ask you something. If you had been sitting at that dinner table, if you had been Lena, could you forgive your parents after that night? And if you were Margaret, how would you live with the moment you told your granddaughter she wasn't family, only to discover she carried the entire family legacy? Tell me what you would have done. Because stories like this remind us of something important. Family isn't proven by suspicion. It isn't measured by doubt. And it definitely isn't decided in one painful moment at a dinner table. Family is the people who stand beside you long before the proof ever arrives. And sometimes, it's the people who finally realize they should have.